Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Cyber Kumite. I'm Tim Wainwright, and this is Chris Salerno. Today, we're going to be talking about NIST CSF versus MITRE ATT&CK frameworks. Today's Kumite is brought to you by RateMyCISO.com. Your CISO runs ragged to get you budget and shield you from internal politics, but now's your chance to gripe about the little things. So, Chris, NIST CSF, MITRE ATT&CK, two very popular frameworks out there right now. What we're going to talk about is just how different they are, but also how they intersect and can be used together. But to start off, who's using these frameworks and why?
Yeah, that's a good question to start with. NIST really focuses on, the five main functions of it are identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. And automatically you hear those things and you say, that's management language. That's what the higher level execs are going to want to understand. And attack is really focused on what real world attackers and pen testers and red teamers, of course, are doing from a technical perspective. So that's more for the practitioners themselves to follow. And so that's the core difference between who's using it, but why do you want to use it, I think, is the next dovetail here.
Yeah. So why would you need why couldn't a single framework contain both of those concepts? Like what's putting these two things, and they're both, NIST CSF's been around for a few years longer.
Yeah.
They're both widely used and referenced right now. Like what puts them at odds? Like why can't they be one and the same?
Functionally, they're just different. Even the layout is different. NIST, you could read like a book. Probably don't do that, although I have. So, you can read through the entire thing. It's written in paragraphs and describes what each one of those functions does and the sub functions underneath them and all that good stuff. The attack framework is essentially a giant Excel sheet. And so it's got cells, and then we now have sub techniques, which we'll talk about in a second. But those are really attacker TTPs. And so they're two different things. And NIST really, the goal of that is to understand if you're going to use it to measure yourself, which is a good place to start. You want to understand where to focus the growth of your defensive program, more on a holistic level. And it helps you understand what skills you might need and FTEs to add to your team based on where you're at with each one of those functions. So, where do I grow my program? The attack framework, I think, is more understanding where your gaps are, both in a technology and a process around that technology. The overlap with NIST are the two functions, protect and detect. So those are the ones that overlap with where attack is, at least in my mind. You could cover the respond function, but that depends on type of testing you're doing. Maybe you're doing red teams, and that's part of it. Also, in NIST, you could do an entire NIST cybersecurity assessment interview based alone. I don't necessarily recommend you do it that way, but it's possible because it's written that way that you could ask questions about each one of them. If you try to do that same thing with each one of the attack assessment techniques, that's not possible. You can't.
You wouldn't get far.
Yeah,
you wouldn't get far with that.
Ask yourself, are we protected against this particular, spear phishing attack? So that's really where we're at from a difference perspective.
So you started to jump into kind of already how do they connect?
Yeah.
And as I've thought about these two frameworks, and I've worked with them both quite a lot. I've worked with NIST CSF since it came out, and MITRE kind of shortly after, but especially a lot now.
Yeah.
One of the things that strikes me that's different about them, and one of the reasons why they can't really come together fully, is the frequency of the updates.
Yeah.
I mean, this CSF is in the mold of other frameworks, and it references all of them, ISO and NIST 853 and all those, which also aren't updated very frequently either. And so to me, one of the key things that puts them at odds is NIST CSF is trying to have a more general framework that shouldn't have to change too frequently, although I think it doesn't change frequently enough.
Yeah.
Whereas MITRE is much more dynamic, and it's not changing constantly, but there's sort of a notion that at least once a year, there's going to be some significant updates. Also, because it in a large way, it's fueled by MITRE's research into threat intelligence. So that's got to be current, right? And the way that and what I really like about Attack is that the authors recognize that, hey, we might not have had our structure right the first time, right? So now, and you mentioned the sub techniques that are coming out. Really reorganizes. It kind of recognizes that that the original presentation needed some reorganization, and they're able to do that. And that's been one of my criticisms of NIST and ISO and these other frameworks for a long time, is they just don't change, and they're not willing to kind of take or minimize things that used to be more important,
right?
That are less so now.
Yeah, I remember early on when you and I both looked at NIST and we had our first conversations with clients around it, and we got to the topic of application security, and they said, "Where do we talk about that?" We said, "Let's have a separate conversation about that, because it's not in there. It's not in NIST.
In there.
They didn't correct for it either." Where I think is Attack does. So I think, to summarize what you're saying, they're both reactive frameworks to what's going on. It's just Attack is able to keep up a little bit better with the change, whereas NIST is slower. And maybe it's just a function of NIST is meant for originally, government agencies, and has been adopted widely by other organizations.
Yeah, by basically everyone. It's sort of, just because of those 5 simple words, identify through recover, it's become a board and audit committee standard. But I think that, I really think that I've been working with it for many years. And every time I look at it, I think to myself, I just wish they would change some core things about it. I wish that they could. I mean, look, it's 108 controls.
Yeah.
I think it could be half of that, and have even more weight and more meaning. I think a lot of the controls in there are just, first of all, there's 3 of them around vulnerability management alone. Like, you don't need that in three places. I don't care if you can argue that a vulnerability management control has some level of protect, detect, and respond, like or identify. I forget which state they're actually in. It doesn't matter. Just pick one. but they don't seem to have that type of flexibility. Now, here's where I think maybe we can provide a little bit of insight instead of just beating things up here. I actually think that NIST CSF really sets up MITRE for success. And I think it does it in a really practical way. And I've talked about this on a couple of other occasions, but I think this is like a good opportunity to recap it while we're talking about how these 2 frameworks can live together, work together. You mentioned identify through recover. What I want to point out there is, I think that there is a sequence in this CSF. It kind of starts with the governance, the asset management, the identity and access, getting into protection, and then the hardening of environments, and then being able to actually detect when we recognize that an attacker may have bypassed those defenses, and then in respond, being able to actually do something meaningful and have a meaningful and quick and effective containment strategy, and then being able to recover from an incident. So there's a life cycle in there. And I think that when it comes to MITRE ATT&CK allows us to go much deeper on the assessment when it comes to the protect and the detect areas.
Yeah.
And what I think is useful about that is, one, there are more controls out of those 108, whether there should be 108 or not, there are. More than half of those controls are together combined into protect and detect. So I think there's more work to do there. And I think that it also allows us to sequence our security testing processes in the right way. So what I mean by that is, and you and I have talked about pen testing, red teams, purple teams before, and we've also shared our opinion before that we think red teams are important, but I think that we're doing more red teams than we should. We should instead be focused on purple teams, because purple teams allows us to go deep on protect and detect, which, as I've just said, are the 2 NIST functions that have the most ground to cover. And purple teams is intentionally trying to be exhaustive at digging into how well is our hardening working at preventing attacks, and how well is our detection working for the type of attack that isn't necessarily going to be prevented, but we need to be able to see quickly when it's happening.
Well, let me ask you this. You mentioned there's a life cycle to the NIST framework. Should we be looking at MITRE as a life cycle too? Do we need to start at the left and go to the right, or can we just pick cells?
I think that's a great question. I think a lot of organizations don't know where to start with MITRE ATT&CK. And what most of them are doing is they're looking at it, unfortunately, they're looking at it as if it was like NIST CSF, because NIST CSF has these 108 controls, and you can assess yourself against all of them, whether it's through interview, collecting some evidence, doing all that stuff, doing it like a classic kind of framework maturity assessment. You can use NIST CSF for that. It's much harder to do that with MITRE ATT&CK, because MITRE ATT&CK, because it's fluid, is going to change much more frequently. We talked about that. But the other issue with it is that not all of the techniques are created equal in MITRE ATT&CK, and they don't all apply in the same way to every environment. And since those techniques are also, and this is a nice service done by MITRE, since they can be pretty easily shown how they relate to specific threat actors, not every industry has the same concerns about all the same techniques. So can you, getting back to your question, can you, where do you start with MITRE ATT&CK? I actually think there's two ways to start with MITRE ATT&CK, and we can talk about which we think is more practical. I think you can take the testing assurance activities that your organization already does. So whether it's internally sourced or externally sourced pen testing or red teams, or purple teams that you're running in-house, and basically target. If you're doing a pen test, you're going to kind of fill out more or less a kill chain or a tactic view of that simulation right across. So you're going to get some coverage across most or some of the tactics as a starting point. Or if you take more of a purple teams approach to it, you look at a specific column, a specific tactic, and say, we need to drill down on this. Like, we suspect that, to your point around initial access, pretty far left in the tactics, and would be a good one to start with. There's a lot of preventative type of controls, especially that you want to assess there. We could do a deep dive there, and that would be a good start. But the problem is, this is the real problem with MITRE ATT&CK, is it's not ready to be shown to executives yet, but it's already happening. And the reason is, executives want to look at MITRE ATT&CK and say, okay, you have 160 plus techniques. Sure, you're telling me that more are going to be added, but that's sort of the universe right now. So show me how you are mapping and aligned, or worse, compliant, which is certainly not a thing in this case, with all of this framework. And we as security practitioners, especially the technical security practitioners who are defending organizations, know that we can't focus on it all at once, nor should we be. And there's a problem, because I think that there's a lot of organizations that have already painted themselves into a corner by doing one particular thing with MITRE ATT&CK framework, and that is taking a theoretical view of their alignment or their readiness. What I mean by that is, and MITRE supplies some of this information, where you could look at any technique and MITRE will say, these are the types of analytics or log sources that you should have coming into your platforms in order to be able to detect it. And so that's helpful. Thanks for the signpost, MITRE. But the problem is, a lot of organizations have created these big, overly optimistic alignment maps that are pure theory of how much of how many of these techniques, maybe upwards of 80% of them, that they can see it, that they should be able to detect in their environment. And then when they do a real validation exercise, hopefully a purple team, but otherwise maybe a red team, they're going to see, wow, this it didn't work. We were supposed to be able to see all this stuff. And we saw very little of it.
You can't do it interview-based. It's not an interview-based framework. You have to do the testing, and to throw it up on a wall and print it out and like plaster it on some giant wall and like start going through it, it makes no sense. I think the other thing, I think you touched on this, that I really dislike when people pull up the entire attack framework is, all right, this is it, and where do we stand? What percentage of this have we knocked out? That's not the way.
That's what I'm saying too, is saying, we have theoretical coverage, but very little of it that I've seen is validated by kind of red, blue, purple teams together.
So knowing that about attack and knowing how you go through a NIST assessment, which is basically start to finish, you should be covering those, is one or the other able to be benchmarked more than the other? So can you get a better benchmarking state out of MITRE because you're doing real testing, or is it better out of NIST because you're going through it the entirety of it?
Yeah, my view is present day, June 2020.
Yeah.
Neither are very suitable for benchmarking yet. NIST, if NIST CSF was going to be useful for benchmarking, it would already be useful. So I actually don't think that will ever be. Anecdotally, this was within the last 6 months, our organization did a NIST CSF assessment of a pretty robust organization.
Yeah.
And we found out within a week or two of starting that they were engaging another firm to do the same assessment. And so, we threw a flag there. We're like, hey, client, that you've got this other firm and that they're going to be doing the exact same thing that we did. And they said, yeah, we want it that way. Now, and first of all, for those of you from smaller shops, wouldn't it be nice to have that type of budget that it didn't matter? You could hire two firms to come in and do the same independent assessment, but they wanted that. They wanted to be able to really be able to say, hey, two different brands validated this, right, for their own reasons and because of their budget. And what was wild about that is doing this work, and we probably finished ours 2 weeks before they finished theirs because we started sooner. The scores on each of the different functions and sub-functions were very different in some cases. So these are, and listen, our team's smart, that team's smart, but the way the questions were asked, the types of additional evidence that was asked by the two different teams made that big of a difference in a swing, in some cases, entire whole points of maturity on a CMMI scale. And so I look at that, sample size of one, I'm not saying it can't be done, but in the same environment, having those results be so different tells me this is not a good way to do benchmarks across the board. But a lot of organizations using this CSF because they say, well, we want to be a 3 in each of these areas or in most of these areas, and tell us how we stack. Well, any consulting firm, first of all, that's giving you a really definitive, your industry is at a 2.5 and you're at a 2.3. Like, you got to question a little bit, how accurate that data is. But the problem is attack in present day doesn't really give us a better benchmark yet either. And that's because the same level of subjectivity can come into carrying out assessments of those attack techniques. And one of the things that MITRE doesn't do is really enrich their information on techniques down to the level of a discrete, fully reproducible test procedure that anybody could run the same way. And it's really hard to do. Yeah, it's really hard to do because, especially if it's based on threat intel, sometimes this type of information or a technique scenario or a procedure that you would associate with a technique might include a remote access tool that's not public, that the bad guys have. So how do you actually put that in a way that any red and blue team working together can simulate that technique and do it consistently across organizations? So benchmarking to me is one of those grails with any framework that the industry wants, but it's just been really hard to do because of how complicated and nuanced security is, whether it's at the process level that NIST CSF can cover well, or whether it's down to the actual attack SIM level that MITRE is aiming to do. Now, I'll say this, and this is just a preview because we're going to be talking about this in upcoming Kumites. We are working with some industry heavy hitters and some of our own researchers to try to come up with a better way to do benchmarking with MITRE. So more on that as it comes. That's all I can say now. But we're obviously bothered by this too, and think that we should be able to do some of these technical benchmarks with attack.
Yeah.
So Chris, we're getting to the top of the Kumite here. Based on what we talked about, what are your recommendations on what frameworks to use and how to use them? Before you answer that, though, one more sponsor message. Don't miss your chance to anonymously lob a public backhanded compliment at your security boss at ratemyciso.com. Yeah. Chris, my question to you is just to kind of wrap this up here. What's your recommendation on how to use? It doesn't necessarily have to be these two frameworks. These are the two that we focused in on.
I think pretty succinctly, you want to use a framework, whether it's MITRE ATT&CK, whether it's ISO, whether it's NIST CSF, you PCI, you pick it. The drive behind it should be to improve your security organization and get better controls in place so that you're protecting your organization better. And the use of those frameworks is going to differ by industry. And within the industry, it's going to differ by how your company is run. So you need to look at it from what are the types of attacks that are focused on your organization first, then expand it out to the attacks that are focused on other organizations like yours. And then if you get really good at that, then you can start tackling some of the other things in those frameworks. That's my recommendation. Focus on you first, which goes back to your comment about benchmarking. Everybody wants it. I don't know that you need it. You should focus on improving your own organization.
Yeah, I think it's good insight and kind of an elephant topic in the room, if that's an expression. Cloud security is not covered by, I mean, forget it for the CSF, like definitely not, but it's not really particularly well covered by MITRE ATT&CK yet either. MITRE has some other guidance. So if you're an organization that's doing cloud transformation, which is almost everyone, in some way, shape, or form, you need to plan for that in your framework. And I think that there's other good cloud resources out there. We'll talk about that another time, but this doesn't solve for really any of that problem yet. But we'll tackle that another time. Hope this has been helpful. I'm Tim Wainwright, reminding you that I taught Chris everything he knows.
And I'm Chris Salerno, and I guess that explains those recurring clown nightmares.